It's a beautiful baby boy, my son. You will live a comfortable and peaceful life as an aristocrat of Spanish heritage should in the late 18th century in Veracruz, New Spain. Where did you get that whiteboard from? Not important. Anyway, I'll name you Antonio. De Padua María Severino López de Santa Ana y Pérez de Lebrón. I want to join the Spanish Army, father. Those are some weird first words. But okay. And join the Spanish Army he did. At the ripe age of 16, this video's main character, Santa Ana, enlisted in the infantry regiment of Veracruz. Oh my gosh! A priest has kickstarted the Mexican independence movement in the town of Dolores. Where did you get that whiteboard from? Not important. Santa Ana fought for the Spanish against the insurgents in Nuevo Santanderan, Texas. He quickly rose through the ranks, becoming second lieutenant and first lieutenant in the same year. Anti-Spanish Republicans and US filibusters, or irregular military adventurers, managed to capture many cities in Texas. This led to a declaration of independence of the Green Flag Republic, but as a part of the Mexican Republic, which wasn't independent yet. This Green Flag Republic, however, was very short-lived, as the Spanish defeated the rebels in the bloodiest engagement in Texas history, the Battle of Medina. Santa Ana was cited for his bravery in the battle, and he followed orders to take no prisoners, which I'm sure won't have any repercussions in the future. A liberal constitutional monarchy was established in Spain in 1820, which limited Ferdinand VII's powers. As a result, the viceregal authority in Mexico City was dissolved, and a power vacuum arose that the nobility wanted to fill. One of these nobles was this guy, Agustín de Iturbide. That's it. I'm switching sides. It's the only way to protect Mexico from the Republican tide coming from Spain. Not so fast, Iturbide. I'm switching sides too. That same year, in 1821, Mexico achieved independence and the first Mexican Empire was established. Iturbide became emperor and rewarded Santa Ana with the command of the port of Veracruz. Meanwhile, the newly formed Congress was mad at Iturbide because they wanted a republic, and an emperor wasn't very republican. I'm telling you, Carlos, the Congress is plotting to overthrow me. Why don't you let them know that they are sovereign over you? You know, so they don't overthrow you. Yeah, you're right. I'm dissolving the Congress and creating a junta that will only answer to me. Iturbide was becoming a dictator, and Santa Ana, being the charismatic person that he was, had significant power in his home region of Veracruz, so he knew he had the support of his people when he rebelled alongside many insurgent leaders to create a republic and a federal system to combat Iturbide's power-hungry ideas. Not able to handle the heat, Iturbide abdicated and was exiled. Among many other things, the new country was defined as a federal republic by the Constitution of 1824. President Guadalupe Victoria was elected, and the states of Coahuila and Texas were united. Okay, everyone, gather around. Not many people live in Texas at the moment. It has fewer than 3,500 residents and 200 soldiers, and we're vulnerable to attacks by Native American tribes and filibusters. Yes, the same guys who fought by our side. So, to kill two birds with one stone, we should legally allow filibusters and US citizens into the region, in hopes they behave and control the indigenous resistance. A flawless plan, sir. I'm sure this won't backfire in literally a couple of years. Oh, I'm not even finished. We'll pay them with land, we'll now call them empresarios, and they will sell even more land to US citizens at super low prices, so they can form colonies all over Texas. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Most of the immigrants came from the southern United States, so many were slave owners. Slavery wasn't technically abolished in Mexico yet, but the practice was very badly seen. To make matters worse, many of them were also Protestant, and Mexico was Catholic. These settlers were given Mexican citizenship, as long as they learned Spanish and converted to Catholicism. But as you may have guessed, the immense majority of them did neither. The United States offered President Victoria to outright buy Texas twice, but he declined both offers. Texas is and will be Mexican. An empresario has just declared his colony independent. What was your offer again? The empresario Hayden Edwards declared his colony independent in 1826, but the other empresarios were having none of it, as they were thriving under the status quo, so they put down his rebellion with help from the Mexican army, but the damage was done. The empresarios now had a bad rep. It's election time. Gómez Pedraza is up against Vicente Guerrero, one of the leaders of the independence movement. I hope Guerrero wins. Pedraza has won by a slim margin, sir. Has he? Let me handle this. A series of revolts then casually broke out in Veracruz, you know, that city under Santa Anna's influence, and Gómez Pedraza eventually decided to concede the elections after these insurrections started making more gains. So Congress declared the election null, and Guerrero was named president. You gotta love good old 19th century democracy. With Guerrero being half indigenous and African, he was quick in banning slavery in all of Mexico, except here, for some reason. The Texians, or Texas immigrants, weren't too stoked with this and threatened with a revolt. Coahuila and Texas Governor Jose Maria Viesca wrote to Guerrero to explain the importance of slavery to the Texas economy and the importance of the Texas economy to the development of the state. So Texas was temporarily exempted from the slavery prohibition rule. Watch out, Mexico! Spain's trying another reconquista. Santa Anna marched to stop them, and after various skirmishes, the Spanish got cut off their supply lines and had to negotiate a surrender. Santa Anna established himself as a national hero and styled himself as the Napoleon of the West. Oh hey, Vice President, what are you doing? I'm organizing a rebellion against you for being a dictator and neglecting the Constitution. What? By the way, the Congress and the Senate have already sided with me and have proclaimed you unfit to rule. I'd flee if I were you. What? Yeah, I'm the president now. What? After accusing Guerrero of being a dictator, Bustamante created a secret police and ordered the suppression of the press, so good job on becoming one. But hey, at least he banned the entry of new slaves into Texas, so good job for real this time. Bustamante was aware that Texians outnumbered Tejanos 4-1, so he implemented a series of laws which prohibited further immigration to Texas from the United States and encouraged Mexican citizens to move there by offering them land and financial assistance. I'm sorry, no new slaves. Slaves? Oh, there must have been a misunderstanding. These are not slaves, they are servants, according to this document, and they work without a salary for some years. 99 to be exact. Well, that's banned too. Fine. So this is what it's come to. We'll just ignore the law. And they did just that. They were able to, because the rest of the country was engulfed in total and utter chaos. Many people rebelled against Bustamante in favor of Guerrero. Amidst the conflict, a Genoese ship captain invited Guerrero aboard his ship in Acapulco to have a meal. "Thank you for having me, Captain. What are we having for lunch?" Oh, is it a surprise? The captain instead surprised Guerrero with a trip to the port of Huatulco, where he was arrested by federal troops and court-martialed. In the very fair trial that followed, he was sentenced to death, even though the decree of September 7, 1829 prohibited it. You gotta love good old 19th century democracy. Oh hey, Santa Anna, what are you doing? I'm organizing a rebellion against you for being a dictator and neglecting the Constitution. What? Well, you allegedly killed Guerrero and are showing signs of being a centralist. As a liberal federalist myself, I cannot tolerate such acts. And what are you gonna do about it? I'm using my influence to democratically return the presidency to Pedraza, the guy I previously disliked and revolted against when he legitimately and democratically won the elections. Now sign here if you want your life spared. Gotta love good old 19th century democracy. But Pedraza's term ended shortly after, and Santa Anna was elected president. The Texians, maybe, probably, used the rebellion against Bustamante as the perfect excuse to take up arms. They expelled the Mexican troops from Texas and managed to negotiate with the Mexican government. We've already been granted by your government a weakening of the laws of April 6, so thank you. We hope our relationship will strengthen now that we have a federalist in charge. Federalist, you say? Yeah, you said so not so long ago. I'm switching sides again. I'm overturning the 1824 Constitution, disbanding militias, dismissing state legislatures, ousting my Federalist vice president, dissolving Congress and assembling it myself again, and inaugurating the Centralist Republic of Mexico. Oh, and you must call me your most serene highness. Federalists throughout the whole country were distraught. Citizens in the states of Oaxaca and Zacatecas took up arms, but Santa Anna was ruthless. After subduing the rebellion, he gave his troops 2 days to pillage. Over 2,000 civilians were killed. Governor Viesca refused to dissolve the state legislature, so he was arrested. Meanwhile, local Texian leaders began calling for a public meeting to determine whether they should become independent, return to federalism, or stick to the status quo. Fearing a Texian revolt, Mexican military commanders in Texas began requesting reinforcements. Santa Anna knew that if the people of Coahuila also took up arms, Mexico could potentially lose a large chunk of its territory, and New Mexico and Alta California would be next. He had to act fast before the United States got involved. He sent his brother-in-law, General Cos, along with 500 soldiers to quell any rebellion in Texas. Stephen F. Austin, a Texian empresario with lots of influence, called on all colonies to raise militias to defend themselves. Mexico was at the brink of of civil war. Let's rewind a few years to the small town of Gonzales. Before things got messy, the Mexican army gave the town a small cannon for protection against Native American raids. But fast forward back to where we left it. Ouch. A Mexican soldier bludgeoned a Gonzales resident, and Mexican authorities thought it would be best to retrieve the cannon. Lieutenant Castañeda pitched camp in a farm near Gonzales with 100 dragoons, but they were attacked by 140 Texian volunteers in a small skirmish where 2 Mexican soldiers died and a Texian got injured after falling off his horse. Castañeda then requested a meeting with Texian leader Henry Moore. Look, Moore, I know what you're thinking. We're not so different. I'm a Federalist too. Believe me, I want a federal Mexico, but I'm honor-bound to follow orders. So please, let's do what's best for this country. Let's avoid bloodshed if possible. Please, would you give me your cannon? I'm not gonna lie, Castañeda. This little speech was pretty moving. Of course, son. I'll go and get it for you. Give me 1 minute. See? I told you that would work. We should probably leave. News of the skirmish spread throughout the United States, encouraging many adventurers to go to Texas to fight. The volunteers elected Austin as the leader of the Army of the People. The Texians then stormed various Mexican forts successfully with the help of some Tejanos and freed Governor Viesca. Thank you for freeing me. I'll recreate the state government as soon as possible. Not so fast, Governor. You've got no power here. Oh, I think the Tejanos will back me up in this one. You don't have the cajones. Try me. It's treason then. Over the next few months, a civil war erupted. This caused the undecided Tejanos to lean towards the Mexican centralists. Austin then marched towards San Antonio and paused 25 miles from it. He then sent a message to General Cos, who was stationed there. Lay down your weapons to avoid the sad consequences of the civil war, which unfortunately threatens Texas. To which Cos answered, I will not yield to the dictates of foreigners. An advance party led by James Fannin camped in Mission Concepcion. Mexican troops engaged them upon knowing that the Texian army was divided, but the Mexican cavalry was unable to fight in the uneven terrain, and the Mexican weapons had a much shorter range than the Texian ones. After 3 attacks were repulsed, a retreat was called. Austin then resigned his command to become a commissioner to the United States, and soldiers elected this guy as their new commander. Morale was falling throughout the Texian ranks, as rations grew smaller and the weather turned cold. After a near mutiny, Burleson received intel claiming that a Mexican pack train of horses was within 5 miles of San Antonio. Knowing it was his only chance, he sent cavalry and infantry to intercept the precious supplies. The Mexicans retreated, and the Texians looted the saddlebags. Rest assured, men, dinner's ready. If you're a horse. Anyway, we should lift the siege and retreat to Goliad until spring. Over my cold, hungry body, Burleson. Men, who's taking San Antonio with me? Several hundred Texians stormed the city, and Cos was forced to retreat to the Alamo, where he finally surrendered. Under the terms of surrender, Cos and his men will leave Texas and no longer fight against the supporters of the Constitution of 1824. Many Texians believed the war was over. Burleson resigned his leadership of the army and left along with lots of soldiers. Frank W. Johnson assumed command of the 400 soldiers who remained. The Texians formed a provisional government called the Consultation. They elected Henry Smith as governor. An army was also created, and Sam Houston was named its commander-in-chief. To attract volunteers from the US, soldiers were granted land bounties. Not long after, Texian soldiers stationed at La Bahia issued the Goliad Declaration of Independence. All right, delegates, independence is a hot topic, but we are not willing to decide the matter ourselves, so I'm calling for elections. We'll vote for delegates that will later vote on the issue of independence. All free white males, please vote. Can I vote? Are you a Federalist? Yeah. Huh, sure. Smith was a bit more radical, and he believed that not even Tejanos with Federalist leanings should vote. It's me, Governor Viesca. I've gathered the support of many leading Federalists in Mexico. We should attack Centralist troops in Matamoros. That's a great idea. That way the bored Texian troops won't desert the army, as they will have some fighting to do. What? How are you falling for this very obvious trap to take the spotlight out of Texas and tie us more tightly to a Federalist Mexico? We shouldn't care about Centralists. We should care about our independence. I'm dismissing the entire council. Not if we first dismiss you, Governor. It was unclear which side had the authority to dismiss the other, as Texas was essentially in anarchy. Anyway, the expedition was approved by the council, and Frank W. Johnson and his aide, Dr. Grant, took the bulk of the army and almost all of the supplies to prepare for it. Who's this guy, you may be asking? Well, he probably was employed by the British government to take the spotlight out of Texas and tie it more tightly to a federalist Mexico and stop it from being annexed by the US. Under orders from Smith, Houston was able to successfully dissuade all but 70 men from following Johnson and Grant. In a desperate attempt to secure alliances, he traveled to Nacogdoches to negotiate with Cherokee leaders. I'm willing to recognize Cherokee claims to lands in East Texas as long as you don't assist the Mexican army or attack us. We'll sign this totally and terrible piece of paper so that we both keep our end of the deal. Okay. President Santa Anna, Your Most Serene Highness, we've got a problem. Geez, you scared me. Did my brother-in-law manage to get the cannon? No, sir. They got humiliated by the Texians and forced to promise not to fight. Texas is out of control. Alright, transfer all of my presidential duties to this guy. I'll personally put an end to the Texian revolt. The majority of the troops from the army he assembled were conscripts or convicts, and their muskets were inferior to the Texian ones, but he believed that with superior planning, it would be an easy victory. Santa Anna ordered the Mexican Congress to pass the Tornel Decree, declaring any foreigners fighting against Mexico pirates, and that they would be dealt with as such, being citizens of no nation presently at war with the Republic and fighting under no recognized flag. This gave the Mexican army permission to take no prisoners, but the recruits serving in the Texian army were unaware of this. Santa Anna met with Cos and his men in Saltillo. I'm sorry, I can't fight. I promised them. Oh, you mean you promised by signing this totally terrible piece of paper? From Saltillo, the army had three choices. They could either advance along the coast from Matamoros to Goliad, march on San Antonio from the south, or march on San Antonio from the west, along the Camino Real. Santa Anna ordered General Urrea to lead 550 men to Goliad. Several of his officers argued that the entire army should have advanced along the coast, where supplies could be gained by sea. But Santa Anna instead focused on San Antonio, the political center of Texas and the site of Cos's defeat. You see, Santa Anna felt as his family's honor had been badly damaged by Cos's surrender, and he was determined to restore it. He led the bulk of his men up the Camino Real to approach San Antonio from the west, to confuse the Texians, who were expecting any advancing troops to come from the south. Urrea reached Matamoros first. He himself was a Federalist, and soon convinced other Federalists in the area that the Texians' ultimate goal was secession, and that their attempt to spark a Federalist revolt in Matamoros was just a method of diverting attention. Now, I know this sounds confusing, so here's a quick recap of the absolute show that Mexican politics was at the time. We've got former Governor Viesca, a Federalist who wishes to unite all Federalists, Mexicans or Texians, and fight against Centralists. Then we've got Urrea, a Federalist himself, but under Santa Anna's leadership, who believes that the whole Matamoros expedition is just a distraction so Texians can achieve independence unbothered. Then we have Dr. Grant, who's supposedly, maybe, working for the British and wants to incite a Federalist revolt in Matamoros with help from Texian troops to tie Texas to Mexico and fight against a common enemy, the Centralists. Then we have Santa Anna, a Federalist turned Centralist who wants to quell a Texian rebellion and Federalist revolts, but prioritizes the Texians at the moment. Then we move on to the Texian Council, who support the Matamoros expedition and are quarreling against Houston and Smith, also Texians, who do not support the Matamoros expedition, probably to avoid shifting the focus of the war to Federalists versus Centralists, and to keep it in Texas secession. Santa Anna? Is anyone talking to me? Your Most Serene Highness? Oh, there you are. The winter's being especially harsh this year. We have reached record lows. Many of the recruits have come from the tropical region of Yucatan and have died of hypothermia. Comanche raiding parties are making sure to kill any lagging soldiers. Shouldn't we call this off until spring comes? Listen, recruit. Fewer than 140 soldiers remained at the Alamo. Houston had given the order to remove the artillery and destroy the complex, but Colonel James C. Neal said that he'd rather die in these ditches than give them up to the enemy. Cavalry officer William B. Travis arrived with some men on February 3, and 5 days later, a small group of volunteers arrived, including the famous politician and militia leader Davy Crockett. On February 23, the Texians sighted the Mexicans and fell back to the Alamo after gathering what food they they could from San Antonio. That same afternoon, over 1,500 Mexican troops occupied the city and raised a blood-red flag, meaning no quarter. For the next 13 days, the Mexican army besieged the Alamo. Remember these two guys leading the Matamoros expedition, Johnson and Dr. Grant? Well, Johnson waited in San Patricio with a small group of men, whilst Dr. Grant and dozens more roamed the area between the Nueces River and the Matamoros in search for more horses. After midnight, Urrea's men surprised Johnson's forces. He managed to escape along with some men, but the remaining were captured or killed. Thanks to local Tejano spies, Dr. Grant's whereabouts were known, and Mexican dragoons ambushed the Texians at the Battle of Agua Dulce. Dr. Grant was among the killed. Urrea had orders to execute those captured, but he instead sent them to Matamoros as prisoners. Remember the elected delegates? Well, they met on March 1 in Washington on the Brazos and submitted a proposed Texas Declaration of Independence, which passed one day later. On March 3, Santana received 1,000 Mexican reinforcements. An attack was imminent. That same day, Officer Travis sent a letter to Washington on the Brazos asking for reinforcements and describing the danger he and his men found themselves in. But the letter wouldn't make it in time. On March 6, Santana attacked the Alamo. Mexican soldiers swarmed the walls and tried climbing them using ladders, but the Texians managed to hold them off. The Mexicans withdrew and regrouped, but their second assault was repulsed too. During their third attack, both columns on the east and west walls shifted to the north wall. After seeing the bulk of his army against it, Santana sent the reserves too, and the soldiers were able to climb up the north wall and get within the compound. Within an hour, almost all of the Texian defenders were killed. However, they managed to put up a fight and inflict heavy casualties on the Mexican army. Of course, these numbers vary greatly depending on the source, but this is a good average. A handful of Texians surrendered. Davy Crockett could have been within them. Your most serene highness, they are pleading for their lives. You should take them as prisoners. I said no prisoners. Santana insisted on their execution. Militarily, the battle was insignificant, but it had an enormous political impact. Travis had bought precious time for the delegates to come up with the Declaration of Independence. Had Santana not paused in San Antonio for 2 weeks, he would have made it to Washington and the Brazos, and very likely would have captured the delegates, or at the very least, make them flee. He hoped that the fate of the Texian soldiers would quell the resistance, but the opposite would happen. That same day, the delegates received Travis's letter. Gentlemen, relax. I'll take charge of the army. You stay here and prepare a constitution for the Republic of Texas. Shoot, I'm not feeling very inspired today. We're just copying this one. Fannin sent men to help evacuate settlers from the mission in Refugio, but they instead spent a day searching local ranches for centralist sympathizers. When they arrived at the mission, they were besieged by Urrea. That same day, Fannin, who was stationed at Goliad, received orders from Houston to destroy his fort, La Bahia, and marched to Victoria, but Fannin was unwilling to leave his men behind, so he sent an extra 120 troops to help them. They successfully drove off Urrea's men, and they returned to Goliad. Nope, they instead spent one entire day searching local ranches for centralist sympathizers. This gave Urrea enough time to assemble 1,000 troops and engage them at the Battle of Refugio. The Texians were able to repulse several attacks and managed to inflict heavy casualties, relying on the greater range of their rifles, but they were at a numerical disadvantage and almost out of ammunition. The Texians ordered a retreat under the cover of darkness and rain. Some managed to escape, but Urrea's men rounded up many of the Texians who hadn't been as lucky and executed some of them. The bulk of Urrea's forces then marched to Goliad to corner Fannin. Colonel Fannin, I believe we should evacuate, sir. I'm still waiting for word from Refugio. Urrea's men could arrive any time. You're right, let's leave. Fannin evacuated the fort, and the Texians began their retreat towards Victoria. We're taking a break, guys. Let's rest and allow the oxen to graze. What? We've only marched for 4 miles. Relax. Urrea won't catch up that fast. He's standing right behind me, isn't he? No, sir, that's an oxen. Phew. Right next to Urrea. Urrea's troops caught up, while Fannin and his force of about 300 men were crossing a prairie. Having learned from his fight at Refugio, Urrea knew that he would be able to encircle them before they made it to the forest 1.5 miles ahead. The Texians formed a hollow square for defense, and managed to repulse 3 charges. 9 Texians were killed, and 51 got wounded, including Fannin. Urrea lost 50 men, with another 140 wounded. Ouch. Even though Fannin's men were running out of ammunition, they voted not to try to break for the forest, as they would have to leave the wounded behind. The following morning, Urrea paraded his men and his newly arrived artillery, and Fannin was forced to surrender. Accounts differ on the conditions of the surrender, as according to the Mexicans, the Texians surrendered unconditionally, but Texian accounts claim that Urrea promised that Texians would be treated as prisoners of war and granted passage to the US. Come on, men, we're going to make it! You've gotta be kidding me. A group of Urrea's men surrounded the Texians who had escaped at Refugio, right as they were going to make it to Victoria. Fannin and his men were shot. In the whole ordeal, approximately 340 Texians died and 27 either escaped or were spared. And done. Let's just make sure we change it up a bit so no one notices. Congratulations! You have been elected President of Texas. What's your first decree? Breaking news! Santa Ana is within 60 miles of us! My first decree is... Run! Burnett adjourned, and the government fled to Harrisburg. He personally carried the Texas Declaration of Independence in his saddlebags. As news of the Alamo's fall spread, volunteer ranks reached 1,400 men. Houston learned of Fannin's defeat too, and realized his army was the last hope for an independent Texas. He used the Fabian strategy of avoiding direct combat, and instead retreating and waiting for the perfect opportunity to engage. By March 28, the Texian army had retreated 120 miles across the Navidad and Colorado rivers. Houston then paused his men at Gross's Landing and rested for the next 2 weeks. Many of his troops deserted, and those who remained were displeased with the cowardice of their commander. His men recovered from illness and began practicing military drills for the first time. The Secretary of War joined the camp with orders from Burnett to replace Houston if he refused to fight, and a letter written by Burnett himself. You must fight them. You must retreat no further. The country expects you to fight. The salvation of the country depends on your doing so. Complaints in the camp became so strong that Houston posted notices that anyone attempting to usurp his position would be shot. He was still waiting for that perfect opportunity to strike. Hey, remember this guy? The one Santa Ana had transferred his presidential duties to? Well, he's dead now. These were some devastating news for Santa Ana. Not because he was fond of him, but because he feared that Urrea's victories would position him as a political rival. He seriously considered returning to Mexico City, but he finally decided to oversee the final phase of the campaign and marched towards San Felipe with 700 men. He also sent a column of troops to join Urrea and the second set of 700 troops to advance onto Nacogdoches, leaving only a small force behind in San Antonio. After he captured San Felipe, Santa Ana led his forces towards Harrisburg. Government officials had fled before the Mexican troops arrived. The whole Republic of Texas had been saved just by a matter of hours. Santa Ana was furious and sent Colonel Juan Almonte with 50 cavalry to intercept the fleeing government officials in New Washington. However, Almonte arrived there just as Burnett shoved off in a boat, bound for Galveston Island. He is still within range, Colonel. Should we shoot? Hold your fire, men. We don't want to endanger Burnett's family. Santa Ana, and probably you, dear viewer, would be forgiven for thinking that the rebellion was in its final death throes. The Texian government had been thrown off the mainland, with no way to communicate with its army, with a commander who had shown no interest in fighting. However, Santa Ana had made a grave mistake. He had divided his army, decreasing his firepower in a potential all-out battle. To make matters worse, Almonte's scout incorrectly reported that Houston's army was going to Lynchburg Crossing to join the government in Galveston. So Santa Ana burned Harrisburg and pressed on towards Lynchburg. The Texian army had finally resumed their march and arrived at Harrisburg. What the hell happened here? Hey you, let's see what you got over there. They captured a Mexican courier, carrying the locations and future plans of all of the Mexican troops in Texas. Houston realized that Santa Ana was not far away, so he galvanized his troops by giving a speech to his men, telling them to remember Goliath and remember the Alamo. His army then raced towards Lynchburg. And this was finally it. The moment Houston had been waiting for. After constantly retreating and avoiding direct combat, he had the perfect opportunity to engage. Santa Ana, the enemy leader, was separated from the bulk of his army, a giant blunder that meant that Houston only needed to win this one small battle to potentially win the war. All of that waiting had paid off. The Texians made camp in a wooded area along the Buffalo Bayou, a location that provided good cover and helped hide their full strength. It, however, left them no room for retreat. Santa Anna, on the other hand, against many of his officers' advice, chose to make camp in a vulnerable location, a plain near the San Jacinto River, bordered by woods, marsh, and lake on each side. Colonel Pedro Delgado, who was present, wrote, "The camping ground of Santa Anna... what was it? His most serene something? Never mind." The camping ground of His Excellency's selection was in all respects against military rules. Any youngster would have done better. And he was right. The two camps were approximately 500 yards apart and separated by a grassy area with a slight rise in the middle. If the Texians were to attack, the Mexicans wouldn't know until they had reached it. Two brief skirmishes happened. The Texians won the first one, forcing a small group of dragoons and artillery to withdraw. Other Mexican dragoons then made the Texian cavalry retreat. Many Texian infantrymen rushed onto the field as the cavalry withdrew, against Houston's objections. A newly arrived Texian volunteer saved two lagging Texian soldiers and was reportedly applauded by the Mexican officers for his bravery. During the night, the Mexicans made earthworks out of anything they could find. In the morning, Cos arrived with over 500 reinforcements, bringing the Mexican force to 1,200 men, outnumbering the Texians. However, Cos's men were raw recruits who had marched steadily for more than 24 hours. Houston then destroyed Vince's Bridge to slow down any further Mexican reinforcements, and at 4 p.m., the Texians began creeping through the tall grass, pulling a cannon behind them. At 4:30 p.m., the battle started with a shot from the cannon. After a single volley, the bulk of the Texian forces broke ranks and swarmed over the Mexican earthworks to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Santa Anna tried to desperately organize a defense, but his officers and himself were yelling conflicting orders. After only 18 minutes, the Mexican soldiers abandoned their campsite and started fleeing for their lives. Some retreated through the marsh to Peggy Lake, but Texian riflemen located on the banks started shooting at anything that moved. "All right, that's enough. We've won. Stop this. There's no need to slaughter them. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad." The Mexicans suffered 950 casualties, whilst the Texians only 40. Santa Anna had escaped towards Vince's Bridge, but after finding it destroyed, he hid in the marsh and was captured the following day. He was brought before Houston. So, about the no prisoners thing. Be quick. Why should we spare you? Santa Anna then proceeded to bargain for his life for weeks and negotiated with Houston and Burnett the Treaties of Velasco, in which all Mexican troops had to retreat south of the Rio Grande and all private property, slaves, had to be respected and restored. Prisoners of war would be released unharmed and Santa Anna would be given safe passage to Veracruz. He also secretly promised to persuade the Mexican Congress to recognize the Republic of Texas and to set the Rio Grande as the border between both countries. Urrea was furious. He was confident that he could challenge the Texian troops, but was forced to march south. He refused to take the slaves back, and many followed the army to Mexico, where they could be free. The Texian government ordered that all Tejanos in the area between the Guadalupe and Nueces rivers migrate either to East Texas or Mexico. New elections were called, and Houston was elected president. He approved a resolution to request annexation to the United States and issued an executive order sending Santa Anna back home. When Santa Anna returned to Mexico, he was not met with the respect he once commanded. Instead, he found himself humiliated, reading in the newspapers how he had been deposed and disgraced. The man who had been one of the most influential and powerful leaders in Mexico was now a symbol of defeat, abandoned by the very people who had once followed him. His return to Mexico was not a homecoming, but a painful reminder of how quickly fortune can change. Looks like you guys won. Are we getting those lands you promised with this paper? Oh, you mean this totally terrible piece of paper? No, you're not.